October 25th, 1944. The sky over Samar is the color of steel, rain squalls stitched along the horizon, and the sea pretends to be quiet. Inside the Combat Information Center, red lights keep night vision alive. Talkers pass words up and down the net. A plotter's pencil taps the edge of a grease pencil line and waits for the next return. The fighter direction officer keeps one hand near the TBS handset and the other on the picture, eyes moving from radar scope to plotting board to the faces around him. He breathes like a man trying not to fog glass. If you want more war told straight, subscribe to Warpath. The carriers are small: Fanshaw Bay with the flag, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Gambier Bay, pushing water at the best speed they can make. Their destroyers, Hoel, Heermann, Johnston, spread out like wiry bodyguards. The escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, John C. Butler. Keep a nervous eye on the gaps. The morning's first reports were supposed to be routine anti-submarine checks. Instead, at about 06:45, a voice on the air breaks the script. Multiple ships, heavy, bearing from the northeast. A lookout tops it off. Smoke columns where the sky should be empty. The radar scope agrees with a hard, unfriendly brightness that doesn't belong here. The CIC pivots in a heartbeat. ASW plots get pushed to the margins. The air picture comes to the center. All fighters, stand by for vector, the FDO says, steady. The talkers echo him, steady too. The plotter makes a note. New group, NE to EN, closing fast. The returns aren't dainty. They're broad and sure, like a fist. Battleships and cruisers are running in with more gun than this little group should ever have to meet in daylight. In 30 seconds, that choice will change a ship's fate. Sprague's order rides the net like a spark. Launch everything you can. That's not a preference. That's survival. Deck crews muscle Wildcats and Avengers into position. Lift what they can, leave what they must. A TBM rolls with depth charges it shouldn't need. A Wildcat goes with guns and fuel and little else. The point isn't perfect ordnance. The point is to put metal and noise into the enemy's face and buy minutes. On the big board, the plotter scribbles an arrow around the task unit's track as the carriers begin a turn to open the range. Another sailor picks up the smoke signal flag. Across the formation, smoke generators cough to life, and the sea takes on gray veils that move and tear with the wind. At 07:06, the FDO calls up to the bridge. Air picture firming, contacts multiple groups, NE to ENE, speed high. He gets a clipped Roger and the authority to run his net. Positive control while the circuits are clean, then negative if congestion chokes them. Assign sectors, outcomes, and let trained pilots make geometry on their own. He draws a tight circle around the carriers. Cap to the east and southeast, Avengers to the north to show themselves and then slide off axis. He writes one word next to the arrows: harass. A Wildcat checks in on frequency. 1-1, Angel 6, Fuel 90, eyes on splashes far. The FDO vectors him toward the broadest set of returns. Skate east, then hook south. Make them look at you. The pilot reads it back without poetry, and the CIC takes that comfort. Another voice, an Avenger leader, low, dragging spray, wants permission to climb through a gap in the weather. The FDO looks at the board, looks at the squall moving like a curtain, and says, use the curtain, no climb until you're clear. That's not theater, that's geometry. As the TBM passes under the heaviest rain, the plotter scratches an updated mark with the side of his pencil, and the FDO feels an inch of relief he won't admit. At 07:10, the first salvos feel their way in. Tall, white geysers that rise in polite columns and then fall with an ugly slap. The CIC can't hear the slaps, but the men inside can feel them through the soles of their feet. Shell splashes, port quarter, a talker reports without letting his voice wander. The board grows more crowded. Enemy course lines arrowing in. Own ships curving away. Cap arcs curling like parentheses around the group. Someone opens a chocolate bar they won't taste. Someone else asks for a repeat on bearing to the nearest cruiser, and the FDO answers like he's reading a grocery list. Destroyer screen, this is flag. Prepare to make smoke and engage by torpedo when ordered. The words come through the TBS with the kind of calm nobody feels. In CIC, the FDO underlines a narrow wedge on the board, the path a destroyer might take to make the best angle on a run. He knows the skippers will choose their own lines once they are committed. He also knows that if the air and sea moves coincide, the enemy picture will fracture at just the right second. A Wildcat checks in, low on ammo, fuel good, making a pass to keep their heads down. The FDO gives him latitude and a distance to threaten. Positive control is a scalpel, negative control is a map. Right now, the map works better. Launch everything you can becomes more than a sentence. It becomes a rhythm. Deck cycles warp to the morning's shape. Land whoever must, turn whoever can, push whoever is next. An Avenger limps across the bow between squalls and drops straight into a respot, while a plane pusher slaps the cowling twice like it's a promise. CIC keeps the nets clean as long as the signals allow. When they don't, brevity rules stand in for comfort. 2 words, a bearing, a number. That's enough. It has to be. At 07:15, the first vectors go out in earnest. Cap, turn 20 left, push north, make a noise. Avenger flight, hold low behind the rain, then fan out. On the destroyer circuits, voices flatten into math. Hoel calculating angles, Heermann checking range lines, Johnston's captain listening for the seam he needs. The FDO watches the arrows on his board and tries to see 10 minutes into the future. A single call cuts the air like a blade, fast and clean. Many ships, battleships, bearing east by northeast, closing fast. Every stomach in the room tightens at once. The plot board thickens until it looks like weather. At U-720, the picture stops being theory and starts being a living thing that crawls. The enemy columns hold their course from the east-northeast, fast and confident. Our formation bends away, laying down smoke like gray curtains that refuse to stay shut. The CIC breathes with the scope. Sweep, sweep, sweep. Return steady, then smeared by rain, then steady again. The FDO rides the rhythm. Positive control when the net is clean, negative when voices stack and step on each other. Cap, 2 contacts, east by northeast, 20 miles, Angels 6 to 8, skate wide and show yourselves. The Wildcats go out like thrown knives. Avengers, hold the squall. When you break, do not break together. The Avenger leader acknowledges, his voice a steady baritone. Copy. Show separate teeth. In 30 seconds, a ship on the other side will look the wrong way. At 07:25, an Avenger noses through a slit in the weather and finds a wall of metal. Cruiser shapes, high bows, wakes arrowing straight at the carriers. He calls the bones of it. Number of masts, height of stacks, the stubborn angle that says armor. He doesn't linger. He presses down into the gray where splashes are just white guesses and pulls out with spray on the canopy. The picture on the board sharpens, not just contacts now, but personalities. The FDO marks a heavy that drifts a little south of the others and writes a short note. Anxious. Radio congestion starts to swell. A Wildcat steps on a destroyer's report. A destroyer steps on a carrier's course change. The FDO kills his own urge to fill the air and instead trims his language until it's bone. Cap north, posture threat. Cap south, hold. He gives the Avengers outcomes instead of routes. Make them cover, force a turn, ignore secondaries. He can feel the pilots smiling at the simplicity. They know what to do with verbs. Johnston checks in with a voice that sounds like a grin, learned the hard way. Johnston, ready to draw eyes, request bearing line to best target. The TBS circuit is supposed to be a private hallway. Today it's a crowded alley. CIC feeds the headings in pieces, bearing to the nearest cruiser, best speed to close, the moment the enemy's own salvos mask his optics. The FDO doesn't tell Johnston to be brave. He tells him where bravery buys the most time. At EO 7:30, the first multi-axis runs begin to hit the enemy's nerves. A Wildcat skims low, guns poking at the bridge glass of a cruiser that didn't expect annoyance this early. An Avenger on the far side fakes a wallowing climb and drags tracers up and away from the formation. Another TBM flashes over the lead column and drops something that won't kill a battleship, but will insult it loudly. What matters is not damage, it's rhythm. The enemy gunners start to hesitate, then chase, then re-aim. Every correction is a missed heartbeat. In 40 seconds, that hesitation will pair with something sharp from the sea. CIC keeps the timing like a drummer. Hoel, window opens in 2. Heermann, wait for his wake. The FDO watches the enemy tracks dip and swell with the rain and smoke and draws a temporary lane through the mess. He hears the talkers behind him, ranges, bearings, corrections muttered like prayer, then repeated loud enough to be law. He circles a patch of weather that walks across the board like a lazy dog and tells an Avenger to sit in its shadow for 20 seconds more than feels right. Patience is a weapon. At 0737, a pilot low on fuel calls it ugly and simple. Winchester soon will make a noise. The FDO gives him latitude and a time on target. Dive shallow. Drag them eyes left. Off in 5. The pilot adds a soft "Roger" that sounds like a sigh he won't admit. He punches forward, peels down at an angle that looks serious enough to hurt, and then streaks away while the cruiser's guns bark at ghosts. The plotter marks the cruiser with a single dot. Distracted. Johnston moves. Hoel feels for the line. Heermann eases toward it like a boxer testing distance. The TBS net carries their math, stripped bare, speed, course, angle for a good shot. The FDO avoids telling them what they already know, and instead clears their lane of friendly air. Cap south, do not cross the wake line. Avengers, break your runs staggered by 10. He knows those 10 seconds are expensive. He spends them anyway. By 0745, the carrier decks grind through the first warped cycle of the day. One Avenger comes back with a smeared canopy and a bent antenna, lines up in rain that slants like thrown nails, and nearly eats a wave on final. A plane pusher on the deck slaps the wingtip with his palm like he can will it straight. The pilot snatches the landing, hook down on the third heartbeat, and rides the deck into hands that hook, chalk, drag. Gas goes in. A depth charge comes off. Something lighter goes on. The plane leaves again with a prayer it won't say aloud. Inside CIC, that near miss registers as a pencil lifted, then set down. The net never stops. Radio congestion crests. The FDO shifts to negative control without announcing it. He assigns a geometry, states outcomes, and trusts training to fill the gaps. Make them turn, protect the carriers, do not die for a splash. The talkers write the last line on someone's soul and move on. A returning Wildcat asks for vectors to the friendliest patch of sky. The FDO gives him a heading and a number of seconds to stay clean before he has to re-enter the mess. He doesn't say good luck. He says, you're covered. At a 7:52, Heermann tastes the edge of a solution. CIC pushes a quick update. The cruiser you want is watching the wrong thing. Its salvo pattern shifted, its helm tight. Window now. It's not poetry. It's a door. Johnston bites somewhere else, hard and noisy, and Hoel moves in a way that makes the enemy forget how simple math can be painful. On the board, arrows stack until they look like a braid. Then, the almost catastrophe. At 07:58, a landing Wildcat catches a bad gust over a wet deck, wobbles, and threatens to turn a narrow ship into a funeral parlor. The LSO's paddles slash once, twice, and the pilot pours power like a man punching through ice. He clears by feet, not yards. The next Avenger is already on the groove, and the deck team is already moving the barriers like they rehearsed under gunfire, because they did yesterday and the day before. CIC hardly has room to flinch. The FDO marks a fresh vector for a KP pair lifting into the gap that Wobble just opened. The net holds. At 08:00, the board says what the men already feel. The enemy's picture is starting to fray, not broken, frayed. Enough for a destroyer to slip a blade under a rib. Enough for airplanes with the wrong weapons to feel like a promise instead of a lie. The FDO taps the edge of the board with a knuckle and gives one more vector that seems too simple to matter. Turn now. Make them look at you, and somewhere ahead, a captain who thinks he sees everything will blink at the wrong time. At 8, Luand, the sea begins to talk in columns of white. Salvos step closer, one neat ladder after another, each rung a little heavier than the last. Gambier Bay turns to work her deck and gives away a sliver of speed she can't spare. The splashes find that sliver. Inside CIC, the air is warm and thin. The FDO trims his language to single strokes. Positive control whenever the net breathes. Negative when it chokes on fear and urgency. Cap north, new straddles, over the carrier's wake, threaten the eyes. Two Wildcats dip and rake a cruiser's bridge from a distance that's more theater than murder, but theater matters when every glance is a weapon. Avengers, multi-axis, stagger by 10. They break from separate curtains of rain and make messy, uneven runs that refuse to be solved on a slide rule. In 40 seconds, a gun captain out there will aim at yesterday's problem. Gambier Bay takes a hit that twists her wake. It's not the noise that carries into CIC so much as the change in the picture. A ship that was keeping time with the rest begins to lag by inches that will soon become yards. Gambier Bay loss of speed. Minor for now, the talker says, trying to make the word minor behave. The FDO widens the cap's arc to put a false wall between her and the heaviest silhouettes. He feels the temptation to talk too much and swallows it. Make them look at you, he tells a fighter pair, and they do. Radio congestion swells and then breaks like a wave. The FDO slides to negative control and draws outcomes instead of lines. Protect the carriers, make them turn, bleed their minutes. An Avenger leader comes back on the air with his voice paper dry. Heavy ships wandering off center will fake a run at the rear. The FDO gives him permission to be clever and a window to be gone. The plotter leans in, a smudge of graphite on his thumb, where a battleship's track keeps trying to burrow through the board. At 0808, a correction ripples through the CIC. A surface contact that was assumed to be pacing the main column shows a small drift. The plotter erases and redraws with his whole shoulder, not just the wrist. South by a hair, he says to no one and everyone. The FDO uses that hair like a lever. Heermann, watch that drift. Your door opens when he compensates. Heermann acknowledges in the dry voice of someone puzzle-sure. In 30 seconds, that correction will save a destroyer. Shells walk toward White Plains, then skip left as a Wildcat cuts across the enemy's sightline. Gambier Bay takes another punch and coughs more smoke than she wants. On the deck of Kalinin Bay, an LSO makes broad, slow circles with his paddles, trying to conjure lift from wet air as a TBM bumps and bounces and finally sticks. Men swarm it like hands around a child. Refuel, rearm, respot. There's no drama in it, only craft. In CIC, the FDO marks the launch window they just bought with 30 racing seconds. A misstep could ruin all of it. At odds 8:15, a KFB pair tries to share a sentence with a destroyer captain, and both end up saying nothing. The FDO triages frequencies like a field surgeon, moving the TBS into a clean pocket and letting the fighters live for a minute on brevity and trust. 2 words, he reminds a talker, without saying the words. The net learns the lesson and stops stepping on its own feet. Samuel B. Roberts surging. Someone reads off a board that suddenly feels too small. On the surface circuits, names collapse into function and courage. Roberts shoves her bow at gunhouses that outweigh her by cities. Heermann turns into a space meant for bigger hulls and makes it his. Johnston, wounded, hauls herself back into the fight, like a boxer who doesn't trust the judges. The FDO doesn't praise them. He clears their sky. Cap south, do not cross Heermann's wake. Avengers, hold your runs 2 beats, let the smoke breathe. He can feel someone behind him stiffen at the phrase, let the smoke breathe, and he doesn't look back, because that would make it a thing. At 0824, a handoff inside the CIC goes wrong for 2 seconds and right forever after. A returning Avengers call gets swallowed by static, just as a KP pair checks in, low on ammo. The assistant FDO takes the fighter call. The FDO slides to the Avenger, and the plotter covers both movements with a finger pressed to the board, where both arrows nearly kiss. You're clear left, the FDO tells the Avenger softly, and the pilot, their pilot, slides left into a gap that wasn't there a heartbeat ago. The assistant FDO gives the fighters a bearing that will put them exactly where a cruiser officer will not want eyes to go. It's a small piece of choreography. It keeps an airplane from becoming a ghost on the net. Gambier Bay bleeds speed. At 0835, her world shrinks to the gray space directly ahead and the noise directly behind. The CIC draws a ring around her and keeps moving it, trying to make it feel like a wall. Wildcats harass, darting at bridges and flak towers, making noise that pretends to be sharp enough to wound pride, if not steel. Avengers make ugly practical runs that throw spray and doubt. The enemy keeps walking his ladders toward the slowest shadow he can see. At 0842, the FDO takes one more risk with time. Avenger flight, hold 10 more. Let them settle into the wrong pattern. A pilot answers with a swallow that rides the word Roger. 10 seconds can be a cliff. The enemy guns establish a rhythm on the wrong target, and then the Avengers break in from two directions. Late enough to rip the pattern, loud enough to make a gunnery officer curse a name he doesn't know. For 40 seconds, the splashes lose their neatness. Heermann uses those seconds the way a thief uses a crowd. The weather helps in sleight of hand and hurts in aim. Rain warps ranges. Smoke makes liars of silhouettes. The FDO no longer tries to perfect the picture. He tries to keep it honest enough to act. He underlines the heaviest threats and circles the friend most in need. The board looks like a battlefield drawn by a tired god. He keeps going. At 0855, the room feels smaller. Gambier Bay is now the slowest heartbeat in a body that needs sprinting blood. Shells bracket her until it feels inevitable. The FDO hates that feeling and works against it with the only tools he owns: vectors, brevity, timing. Make them cover. Make them correct, he says to no one and everyone. A Wildcat dives because the order is a verb, not a speech. An Avenger fakes heavy intent and gives a cruiser a bad guess to chew on. The fatal window arrives almost politely. Around 09 Zerbal, the ladders lose their wobble and begin to meet in the middle. Gambier Bay's wake looks wrong to men trained to read water. The CIC can't patch a hole in a hull with a sentence. It can only keep building doors where there were none a minute ago. Cap east, noise now, now, now. The fighters push, and for moments it works. A gunnery officer blinks, a salvo walks long, a breath is borrowed. Around 0905, the line breaks. A hit lands where willpower can't compete with steel and math. Gambier Bay shudders into a reality the CIC can chart, but not lift. The FDO writes her name on the board with a pressure that nearly tears the paper underneath. He doesn't say anything heroic. He doesn't change his voice. He moves the cap again, vectors another Avenger, clears TBS for a destroyer that still believes in knife work. The picture is shredded but alive, and as long as it lives, men can move inside it. By 0910, the water tells the truth no one wants. Gambier Bay is falling behind the only safety she ever had: speed. The CIC keeps the net coherent because that is what it can do. The FDO taps the board once and gives a vector that dares the enemy to look away at the worst possible time. Somewhere out there, a turret hesitates for a breath that could have been iron. And in 10 minutes, the enemy will begin to wonder if his picture is wrong. At 0920, the picture bends. Not a clean break, more like a fray that suddenly matters. Enemy tracks that were arrow straight begin to waver. Tiny course changes that look like nerves. The rain helps, the smoke lies, and the sky turns the color of old tin. Inside CIC, the FDO watches the enemy waver and makes a call in his head before he says it out loud. They're doubting what they see. Cap north, posture threat. Cap east, widen your arc, force their glass to swing. The Wildcats extend and rake the edges of the enemy's vision, not to kill, but to make officers on far bridges shout for bearings they can't lock. Avengers, echo that confusion, stagger by 15, show them shapes where we are not. The board receives the new choreography. Arrows slide apart, never breaking contact with the carriers they protect. In 30 seconds, a cruiser captain will choose the wrong correction. Heermann takes her chance and crosses a wake that should have been off limits to smaller things. Hoel slides toward a lane that only exists because smoke found a new seam. Johnston, wounded and stubborn, shows herself where she has no right to be and pulls a glance that the enemy can't afford to give. The CIC doesn't script their courage, it scripts the silence around them so their choices echo louder. TBS stays clean for the screen. Fighters live for a minute on brevity and habit. The FDO's pencil taps the board once, then twice, as if he can drum a heartbeat into a picture that keeps trying to fall apart. A ripple runs through the enemy columns. Hard to see, easy to feel if you've been watching all morning. A lead ship eases a few degrees, then brings it back, like a driver second-guessing an exit ramp. Another command ship delays a salvo by a heartbeat, while something invisible makes him check his math. CIC doesn't call it victory, it calls it window. Avenger flight, time on faint now. Cap east, press with noise, then break. The board marks the feint with a thin line that refuses to be straight. On the water, it looks like distraction. In a plotting room, it looks like hope with good posture. At 09:28, the first clean sign appears. Enemy salvos that had held a neat ladder toward a slowing carrier now scatter for a few precious volleys. The FDO mutters, "Good," not to praise, but to confirm. Cap, bite, short, loud, away. Wildcats dip, flash, and go, leaving only noise and indecision behind. An Avenger drags 2 guns across the wrong sky for the right 12 seconds, then disappears behind a range sheet that walks across the sea like a tired giant. Heermann calls a range and gets an answer so fast it feels like fate. Only it isn't. It's work. Loss doesn't stop for doubt. Gambier Bay is still dying the way bad math always does. Slow, then suddenly. CIC notes what the eyes can't stand to linger on. A talker writes her status in careful letters that won't change the physics. The FDO shifts the cap again, making a moving wall around a ship that can no longer run, and keeps the larger chore in mind. Keep the rest alive long enough to matter. The turnaway isn't a trumpet call. It's a series of human decisions that add up to distance. Around 09:35, the enemy columns begin a slow heel that tells the truth their pride won't say on the circuit. They've lost the rhythm. They don't trust the picture. A destroyer's torpedo wake they half saw becomes a story they can't risk disproving. An Avenger's shadow becomes a threat that costs them 5 degrees of doubt. Rain calls itself an island for a minute and wins the argument. On the board, those little changes look small. In the world outside, they become survival. Shift priorities, the FDO says, and the room moves like a body obeying its own reflex. The deck cycle goes from emergency heartbeat to planned recovery. Land who must, fuel who can, arm who's next. A returning Wildcat squeaks a landing in crosswind and is manhandled into a safe corner by men who have been running on coffee, fear, and muscle memory since before dawn. A TBM taxis with a wheel that hates the day. The crew fixes what they can in 90 seconds and calls it good, because there's no such thing as perfect in this weather. CIC logs the next launch window, a neat rectangle written over a messy day. Silences begin to appear on the net, the kind that follow names. A destroyer escort that was talking a minute ago isn't. No panic, just a new shape on the map, and a voice you won't hear anymore. The CIC absorbs it without a speech, because grief is a luxury for quiet rooms. The FDO circles a blank patch on the board where a friend used to be and pushes the cappy 2 degrees to cover the hole. He writes a time next to the circle, because the board needs numbers, not apologies. The carriers breathe, just a little. White Plains' wake looks cleaner. Kalinin Bay's deck crew gets a full 2 minutes to handle a landing pattern without a near-death improvisation. St. Lo's topside men actually hear themselves speak between launches. The FDO takes advantage of those breaths like a miser. Redistribute cap. 2 east, 1 north, 1 reserve. He puts a reserve in his pocket like a coin he knows he'll spend soon. Avengers, rearm for surface if possible. If not, keep them guessing. The answers come back clipped, professional, human. Copy, guns only. Copy, 1 fish aboard. Copy, unarmed but loud. Between 0950 and 1010, the enemy's wake lines lengthen with the kind of haste that doesn't show up in memoirs. Smoke and weather hide the worst of their embarrassment. The sea records it anyway. CIC refuses to call it over. Doubt can reverse. Pride can return. The FDO stays mean with his timing, throwing small distractions like jabs, keeping the gunnery eyes busy, shaping the air picture for a fight that shifts every 10 minutes. He marks a final smear of enemy track on the east edge of the board and draws an arrow that points away. He doesn't smile, he exhales. Strategic meaning walks in without knocking. The transports off ladies keep their sky. The men unloading crates and promises on wet beaches will live to hear a rumor about little carriers and thin destroyers that refuse the script written for them. Inside CIC, that grand sentence reduces to 1 word the FDO can actually use. Continue. Continue deck cycle, continue cap redistribution, continue deception. He says it like a litany because that's what keeps the picture from going soft. Then the air changes. It's small at first, the quality of noise on a circuit. the way a voice hesitates before calling a contact that isn't neat, a radar return that sits too low to respect. The FDO marks the eastern edge of the board with two small, crawling notes and underlines them. Low. Low returns are hard to love. They blend with sea clutter. They hide in the folds of weather. They don't give you time to be elegant. Cap east. Investigate low-speed, low-altitude contacts. Do not overcommit. He puts steel in the caution, not fear. The fighters slide that way, already tired, already hungry for simple problems. The net hears a kind of confidence that is really discipline pretending to be comfort. In 30 seconds, the picture will tilt toward a new kind of threat that training has not yet had time to name. At 10:18, a voice from a picket whispers a line that stiffens spines. Low bogeys multiple threading the squalls. The FDO asks for altitudes and gets guesses. Angels 1, Angels 2, maybe less. He doesn't like maybe. He draws a hatched box on the board where low meets hidden and puts the reserve cap in motion without ceremony. The carriers keep the cycle humming, but the noises on deck change. More heads turned up, fewer jokes that no one would have laughed at anyway. CIC pivots a second time that morning, from survival by confusion to survival by proximity defense. It's a new geometry with old tools. The FDO cleans the TBS again, shortens the leash on his own voice, and swaps elegance for bluntness. Warn, vector, intercept. If you miss, warn again. The board is a living thing. It understands before anyone writes it down. The men in the room don't speak the word that belongs to what's coming. They don't need it. They can feel it sliding low and close, where pictures get fuzzy and seconds turn mean. At 10:30, the contacts feel wrong in a way the scope can't show. They creep at the edge of sea clutter, the returns thin and stubborn. Low bogeys, east and southeast, slow, the picket says, making slow sound like a warning, not a comfort. The FDO underlines the word low on the board and clips his voice to fit the problem. Cap east, vector 080, Angels 1 to 2. Cap north, hold altitude and guard the gap. The fighters are tired, the radios are tired, and the day has made everyone older than they were at dawn. In 30 seconds, the geometry will fail if it's going to. Low profiles are a bad joke in this weather. Radar loses confidence when targets ride the wrinkled skin of the sea. Eyes on deck, trust the wrong glints. The FDO tries to buy angles with seconds. Turn early, cut across, don't chase. He watches the little hatched box he drew, where low meets hidden, slide closer to the carrier's wakes. St. Lo's deck crew keeps the cycle beating, but the men on her island keep looking out and down, searching for threats that don't want to be seen. Contact low, east-southeast, coming in 2s and 3s. The voice sounds like it's pushing through wet cloth. The FDO tightens TBS, trims every sentence until it's only a verb and a number. Warn, vector, intercept. Sappy pairs roll off headings and dig for air that doesn't exist at 50 feet. A Wildcat gets a flash of shape, a single engine speck with the purpose of a thrown knife, and turns to cut across it. Another pair chases ghosts, then breaks off clean because the FDO told them not to chase. At 10:38, a pilot calls it too fast to soften. Low contact committed, bearing 100, closing. The FDO vectors the nearest pair and feels the math in his bones. The closure is wrong, the height is too low, the speed barely respectable until the last 10 seconds when it matters most. He plays the only card left, get guns in the path, put tracers in the driver's eyes, make a human decision, wobble. Intercept now, make him think. The fighters do, sharp and clean, and for a handful of heartbeats it looks like the old play still works. More contacts appear with the same stubborn pattern. A few get pushed wide by gunfire and nerve. A few try too early, too high, and pay for the mistake. The rain and smoke take sides without telling anyone. The FDO feels the carriers tightening around the idea of themselves. White Plains keeps her pattern tidy. Kalinin Bay's LSO rolls his wrists as if he can right lift into wet air. St. Lo's deck runs like a choreographed argument with time. She keeps putting planes back into the sky, even as the sky sends back questions she hasn't met before. The first hit almost happens at 10:44, a low in and out that dies in flack, and a last-second jerk from a pilot who prefers living to legacy. The men on the carriers want to call it justice. The FDO doesn't let the word in. He keeps calling vectors, keeps converting fear into geometry. Cap southeast, slice across 20 degrees, don't descend too far, keep energy. He puts one pair exactly where the next bogey has to cross, and for a breath, the world agrees with him. Tracers stitch the gray. The bogey wobbles, smokes, quits. The scope loses him, the eyes confirm, and the net breathes a little. At 10:48, a voice comes in, too calm for comfort. Multiple low, closing St. Lo axis. The FDO swings a reserve pair and buys them an intercept that looks almost elegant, until a squall steps between them and reality. The returns smear, the deck wind shifts. The reserve pair goes high to preserve energy and loses sight at the worst time. "Warn St. Lo," the FDO says, and the talker is already saying it, his voice a knife. Low inbound, starboard quarter. St. Lo hears it. Her guns are already up. The men at the mounts are seasoned enough to use fear like a sight. Around 10:50, the day writes a new rule in real time. A low, single-engine attacker slides out of a seam in the weather on a line nobody wants. He is too close for elegance, too committed for negotiation. St. Lo's guns stitch the air in clean arcs. A fighter cuts a diagonal and throws a string of light that tries to bend a human will. The aircraft doesn't bend. It drops into the last part of the last dive and turns altitude into certainty. The impact is a hard, ugly slam that sounds like physics choosing a side. There's a flash, then a twist of smoke that shows where heat has found new work to do. No one in CIC talks about flames or bodies. They talk about systems. They talk about borders between compartments and what must be shut. They talk about space and time. The FDO's voice doesn't rise. He vectors a pair south to catch whatever else comes through the same seam. He shifts KP to cover the gap that St. Lo leaves even as she refuses to admit she's leaving. The deck cycle for the others keeps grinding because the only answer to shock is procedure. St. Lo's picture on the board becomes a circle with a note the FDO forces his hand to write neatly. He doesn't say the word that belongs to endings. He moves air where it's still useful. After the hit, the room finds the sound of work again. Warnings keep their shape. Vectors keep their edges. The FDO pushes the cap outward in a shallow ring and keeps the pickets talking. Low watch continues. Intercept per procedure. Do not get drawn into the deck. He refuses to let the new threat steal discipline. He makes the language short and fair and firm, because language is a weapon here too. By 10:55, the picture eases, not because the day is merciful, but because the human beings left in it still know their jobs. The Ka-P stretches lean but present. The carriers that can recover do. The destroyers hold a wall around a wound and keep looking outward. The FDO stands over a board that looks like a diary written in arrows and times and decisions, and he lets his pencil hang. In 30 seconds, he could start to believe in quiet. He doesn't. The rest of the morning belongs to details, rearming one more Avenger for a kind of work it wasn't built to do, moving a KP pair 2 degrees because the sea says so, untying a knot on the net before it jams the next order. The doctrine writes itself in the margins. Fighter direction isn't a trick. It's a brain that keeps beating no matter how the threat changes. CIC proves it can hold a picture together under battleship fire, and then pivot to a defense that assumes the enemy will fly like a blade at the deck. Processes become muscle. Muscle becomes culture. Culture becomes survival. By noon, the men off Leyte don't know the names of the ships that bought them sky. They don't need to. The rumor will carry the right truth in the wrong words. Little carriers stood under giants and lived. In CIC, the grand version compresses to the simplest job. Keep the next vector honest, keep the next warning on time, keep the next pilot from flying blind into a problem that has learned a new shape. The picture is smaller now, and somehow larger. The room is tired enough to lean. It doesn't. This video's content was compiled from multiple sources. If anything is incorrect or needs clarification, please comment below. See you next time.